On the night of October 14, 1962, a man named Harold Voss walked out of his house in Harlan County, Kentucky, and was never seen alive again. His daughter Eleanor had just turned 16 that day. There had been a small celebration, a cake with buttercream frosting, a new dress hanging on the back of her bedroom door, candles that she blew out in one breath while her father watched from across the table with an expression she would later describe as grief wearing the mask of pride. By midnight, Harold's truck was still in the driveway. His coat was still on the hook beside the front door, and his wallet sat on the kitchen counter with $43 inside it. But Harold Voss was gone, and the people who came looking for him, the sheriff, the neighbors, the men from the church, they all assumed the worst had already happened. They were wrong. What had happened was so much worse than death. Harlan County in 1962 was a place that knew how to keep secrets. The coal industry had spent decades teaching the mountains to swallow things whole. Labor organizers, safety reports, the names of men who asked too many questions. The town of Claiborne, where the Voss family lived, sat in a narrow hollow between two ridgelines so close together that the sun only reached the valley floor for about 4 hours each afternoon. The rest of the time, the town existed in a kind of permanent twilight, and the people who lived there had grown accustomed to operating in the spaces between light and shadow. Harold Voss had grown up there. He knew the hollow. He knew the people. And according to his daughter Eleanor, he had known for almost 2 years that something was wrong. Harold worked at the Meridian No. 4 mine, had worked there for 19 years, and was the kind of man who noticed things. He noticed when the timber supports in Shaft 7 started showing stress cracks that nobody reported. He noticed when 3 men were quietly transferred off his crew and replaced with workers from out of county who kept to themselves and asked no questions. He noticed when the ventilation readings on the daily logs started matching numbers that didn't correspond to anything he could measure himself standing in those tunnels. He had written things down. Eleanor found his notebooks after he disappeared. Small composition books filled with his careful handwriting, dates and figures and names and observations going back to March of 1961. She was 16 years old and she sat at the kitchen table and read every word. And by the time she finished she understood that her father had not simply walked away from his life on the night of her birthday. He had been walked away from it. The sheriff at the time was a man named Curtis Beale, who had held the office for 11 years and was widely understood to be on friendly terms with the Meridian Mining Company's regional management. When Eleanor brought him the notebooks 3 days after her father disappeared, Bill looked at them for about 90 seconds, handed them back, and told her that men sometimes needed to clear their heads and that Harold would most likely turn up in a few days. He suggested that Eleanor stay with her aunt until things settled. He used the word overwrought to describe her. She was 16. Her father had vanished without his wallet or his coat, and the sheriff used the word overwrought. Eleanor Voss went home, hid the notebooks behind the insulation in the attic crawl space, and began doing something that no one in Claiborne expected her to do. She started asking questions of her own. What she found over the following months would not be fully understood for another 11 years. The complete picture did not emerge until 1973, when a federal investigation into mining safety violations in eastern Kentucky inadvertently cracked open something far darker than anyone in Washington had anticipated. But Eleanor Voss had already assembled most of it by the time she was 17, working alone in a town that did not want to know what she was learning, with nothing but her father's notebooks and a stubbornness that people who knew her described as almost frightening in a girl that young. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to October of 1962, but to a night almost exactly 20 months earlier, in February of 1961, when Harold Voss came home from his shift at the mine and sat at the dinner table without speaking for so long that Eleanor asked him if he was sick. He wasn't sick. He had that afternoon witnessed something in the lower section of Shaft 9 that he didn't yet have words for. A meeting. 6 men gathered around a folding table set up in a drift about 300 yards from the main shaft, far enough from the entrance that sound didn't carry and deep enough that a man could be reasonably certain no one would wander past. Harold had gone into that section to check a measurement that his crew chief had asked him to verify. He wasn't supposed to be there at that hour. The 6 men didn't see him, and Harold, to his later regret, didn't announce himself. He pressed himself against the ribs of the tunnel and he listened. 2 of the men he recognized immediately. One was a mine foreman named Douglas Pruitt. The other was a man named Robert Callum, who was the assistant regional director for Meridian's eastern operations. The other 4 he didn't know by name, though he recognized two of them as having been at the mine in some official capacity during a safety inspection the previous autumn. What they were discussing, in calm and businesslike voices, was the deliberate manipulation of the methane monitoring system in Shaft 7 and 9 to conceal readings that would have triggered mandatory evacuation and remediation protocols under federal law. They were not debating whether to do this. They were discussing how they had already been doing it for 14 months, how they intended to continue, and what would happen to any member of the workforce who raised concerns about the readings. What would happen, Harold heard, was described in terms that were practical and cold and left very little to the imagination. One of the men Harold didn't recognize used a phrase that stayed with Harold for the rest of his life, or at least for the 20 months of life that remained to him after that February evening. The phrase was a permanent resolution to a temporary problem. Harold wrote it down that night in the first of the composition books. He underlined it twice. He spent the next 14 months trying to figure out what to do. He was not a naive man. He knew that Meridian controlled most of the economic life of Harlan County. He knew that the company had relationships with the county sheriff, with the circuit court judge, with at least 2 members of the state legislature. He knew that men who made trouble for powerful interests in places like Claiborne had a way of finding themselves unemployed, evicted, and eventually forgotten. He had a daughter to raise alone. Eleanor's mother had died of pneumonia when Eleanor was 9, and he did not make moves without thinking through what they would cost. So he documented. He wrote everything down. He measured and recorded. He built a case the way a patient man builds a case, carefully, methodically, waiting for the moment when it would be enough. What he didn't fully account for was the possibility that the men he was building his case against had people watching, that someone in Claiborne, someone who ate at the same diner, sat in the same pew on Sunday mornings, waved to Eleanor on her way to school, was reporting back on Harold's movements, his questions, the subtle shifts in his behavior that signaled he was getting close to acting. Eleanor would later conclude that there had been at least 2 such people. She never knew for certain who they were, but she came to believe that by the summer of 1962, Douglas Pruitt knew that Harold Voss was a problem, and by September, he had decided what to do about it. This is Grim Vale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. Eleanor's investigation began the way most things began in Claiborne, through other people's carelessness with words. 3 weeks after her father disappeared, she was working the Saturday morning shift at the pharmacy where she had an after-school job, and she overheard a conversation between 2 women she knew only as customers. One of them, a heavy-set woman in a blue raincoat whose name Eleanor later learned was Patricia Holt, was telling the other that her husband had come home on the night of October 14th, the same night Harold vanished, looking like he'd seen something that scared 10 years off him. Patricia Holt's husband worked at the mine. He was a shift supervisor named Gene Holt who, according to his wife, had gone very quiet after Harold's disappearance and had started drinking in a way he hadn't since before Eleanor was born. Eleanor rang up their purchases and said nothing, but after her shift, she walked to the Holt house on the far side of Claiborne's main road and knocked on the door. Patricia answered. Eleanor told her who she was, and she watched something move behind Patricia Holt's eyes. Fear, pity, recognition, something complicated that didn't resolve into any one thing. Patricia said her husband wasn't home. Eleanor said she knew, and that she wasn't there to speak to Gene. She was there because Patricia had said something in the pharmacy, and because Eleanor Voss was 16 years old and her father was gone, and she was asking, very politely, for anything that Patricia might be willing to share. It took 4 visits over the course of 6 weeks before Patricia Holt told her anything of substance. What she finally said was this, that on the morning of October 15th, Gene had come home from a night shift at the mine and told her, in a voice she didn't recognize as his, that Harold Voss had gotten into a truck with Douglas Pruitt the previous evening, and that Gene did not think Harold had gone willingly. She had asked Gene what that meant. He had told her it meant that she should never repeat it to anyone, that he was sorry he had said it, and that the best thing for both of them was to forget it and go on living. Patricia had done exactly that, more or less, until she said something careless in a pharmacy to a woman she didn't know, and a dead man's daughter heard it through a wall. Eleanor wrote all of this in a notebook of her own. She had started keeping records in imitation of her father, and the habit would stay with her for the rest of her life. She now had a name, Douglas Pruitt, and she had a time frame. Harold Voss had gotten into a truck on the night of October 14th, 1962, the night of Eleanor's 16th birthday, while his daughter blew out candles and made a wish she never told anyone. She later said that she had wished for her father to be happy. She never stopped thinking about that. Douglas Pruitt was not a man who was easy to approach directly. He was 38 years old in 1962, a compact and watchful man who had come up through the mine from laborer to foreman in 12 years, and who was understood in Claiborne to be the kind of person you did not antagonize. He had a wife, 2 sons, a house on the better side of town, and a reputation for fairness on the job that Eleanor found, as she investigated, to be carefully constructed and essentially hollow. The men who worked under him respected him because they were afraid of him. That distinction, she would write in her notebook, matters. She spent the winter of 1962 and the spring of 1963 building a picture of Pruitt, of Meridian, of the network of relationships that connected the mine to the county's power structure. She found a man named Arthur Gilliam who had worked at Meridian until 1959 and had been dismissed, he believed, for asking questions about safety practices in Shaft 7. She found a woman named Shirley Tate whose brother had died in a mine accident in 1960 that the company had classified as operator error, but which Shirley, who had read the accident report carefully, believed was the result of the same ventilation problems Harold had documented. She found 2 men who had transferred off Harold's crew in the summer of 1961, the transfers he had noted in his composition books, and while neither of them would speak to her directly, one of them slid a folded piece of paper under the door of the pharmacy where she worked. The paper had 3 words on it: "Ask about Denton." It took Eleanor another 4 months to understand what that meant. William Denton had been a safety inspector with the Federal Bureau of Mines who had conducted an inspection of the Meridian No. 4 mine in October of 1961. His report, which Eleanor eventually obtained through a contact at the county clerk's office, was unremarkable: standard language, a few minor citations, an overall clean bill of health for the operation. But William Denton had died in January of 1962, 9 months before Harold disappeared, in a single-car accident on Route 119 outside of Harlan. He had gone off the road on a clear night with no ice and no apparent mechanical failure. The state police report listed it as an unexplained accident. Eleanor read that report 11 times and thought about the phrase she had found in her father's notebook: a permanent resolution to a temporary problem. By the summer of 1963, Eleanor Voss was 17 years old, had assembled a file of notes and documents nearly 2 inches thick, and had told exactly 2 people what she was doing. One was her Aunt Margaret, her father's sister, who had taken her in after Harold's disappearance and who was frightened by what Eleanor was learning but did not try to stop her. The other was a young man named Thomas Wicker, who was 22 and worked at the county newspaper as a typesetter and who had ambitions of being a reporter that the newspaper's editor, a man of profound professional timidity, consistently frustrated. Thomas listened to Eleanor and read her notes and was the first person besides her to say out loud, in plain language, what the evidence was beginning to suggest. He said it quietly, in Margaret's kitchen, over a cup of coffee, while Eleanor watched his face. "These people didn't just silence your father," he said. "They've been running a killing operation out of that mine for years, and they've got half the county covering it up." Eleanor nodded. She had known this for months. It was different, somehow, to hear someone else say it. The question of what had actually happened to Harold's body was one that Eleanor circled for years, without being able to answer definitively. The mine was the obvious location: vast, deep, riddled with waked-out sections that hadn't seen an active crew in years, full of the kind of spaces that swallow things permanently. Harold's composition books contained 2 entries from his final weeks of work that referred obliquely to the lower wake sections of 9 in a way that suggested he had been down there and had found something that disturbed him. Eleanor was not willing to go into the mine herself, and she didn't know anyone who was both willing and capable. That avenue of investigation stayed closed to her. What she found instead, in the late summer of 1963, was a man named Calvin Pruitt who had been a contract worker at Meridian in the autumn of 1962, and who was now living in Lexington, working at a gas station, and drinking more heavily than was good for him. Calvin Pruitt had heard about Eleanor through Thomas Wicker, who had been quietly reaching out to former mine employees for months. Calvin called the pharmacy one morning and left a message that consisted of a Lexington phone number and the words, "I was there that night." Eleanor got the message on her lunch break. She called the number from the pharmacy's back office, standing very still and speaking very quietly, and Calvin Pruitt told her what he had seen on October 14, 1962. He had been working a late shift doing maintenance on ventilation equipment in the lowest sections of the mine. He was not supposed to be where he ended up being, which was in a narrow connecting drift between Shaft 8 and Shaft 9, at approximately 11 o'clock at night. He had gotten turned around. The lowest sections were a maze, the marking system was inconsistent, and a man who didn't know them well could spend an hour walking in circles. He had found himself, eventually, standing at the entrance to a widened section of Shaft 9 that had been used for equipment storage and had been officially out of operation for 3 years. There was light coming from inside. He had looked in without thinking, the way you look at a light in a dark place before your brain catches up with your instincts and tells you to think carefully about what you're doing. He saw 4 men. He saw Douglas Pruitt. He saw Robert Callum. He saw a man he didn't know then but later identified, when he saw his photograph in the newspaper, as a county official named Warren Haas. And he saw Harold Voss, who was on the ground, and who was not moving, and who, Calvin Pruitt said this with the flatness of a man who has spent a year trying to make himself not remember something, was clearly past any help that anyone could offer. Calvin Pruitt had backed away from that entrance very slowly and very carefully, and he had gotten out of the mine, and he had driven to Lexington that same night, and he had not returned to Harlan County since. He told Eleanor all of this in a voice that shook in certain places and was unnaturally steady in others. He told her he was sorry. He told her he should have said something sooner. He told her he had been afraid, and that being afraid had not made him feel better about himself, and that he had thought about Harold Voss's daughter almost every day for the past year. Eleanor thanked him. She asked him if he would be willing to put what he'd told her in writing. He said yes. She asked him if he would be willing to speak to a lawyer. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said yes again, in a way that suggested the yes was costing him something real. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The problem with what Eleanor had assembled was that it was not yet actionable in any of the conventional ways. The county sheriff was compromised. The circuit court judge had connections to Meridian's parent company that Thomas had uncovered in his own research. The state police had investigated Harold's disappearance in a manner so cursory that Eleanor's notes on the investigation took up half a page. The Federal Bureau of Mines had a relationship with Meridian that was, at best, described as cozy. The clean inspection report that William Denton had filed, which Denton had likely been pressured to falsify, was the agency's official record on the facility. There was no obvious door to knock on that wasn't already closed from the inside. What eventually cracked it open was not Eleanor, and not Thomas, and not Calvin Pruitt. It was the mine itself. On March 8, 1965, a methane accumulation in Shaft 7 reached a level that even the falsified monitoring system could not fully conceal, and a spark from a piece of maintenance equipment ignited it. The explosion killed 11 men. It injured 23 more. It destroyed a substantial portion of the mine's infrastructure and set off a federal investigation that Meridian could not manage, contain, or redirect because 11 men were dead, and reporters from Louisville and Cincinnati and eventually New York had come to Harlan County and were not going to leave until someone explained what had happened. Eleanor was 19 years old when the explosion happened. She had been waiting, in the specific way that someone waits when they have no choice but to wait, for almost 3 years. When she heard the news, she went to her aunt's house and got her file, 2.5 inches of notes and documents by then, and she drove to Lexington to find Calvin Pruitt. He was still at the gas station. He looked older than a man of 26 had any right to look. Eleanor sat across from him in a diner and told him that the time she had been waiting for had arrived, and that she needed him to be ready to tell what he knew, and that she understood what it would cost him, and she was grateful beyond words. Calvin looked at his coffee cup for a long time. He said, "Those men who died in that explosion, did any of them know what Pruitt and Callum were doing?" Eleanor said she didn't know for certain, but probably not. Calvin nodded slowly. He said, "Then I'm ready." The federal investigation into the Meridian No. 4 disaster took 18 months and produced a report that documented systematic falsification of safety records going back to at least 1960. Douglas Pruitt was indicted on federal charges related to the safety violations. Robert Callum was indicted. Warren Haas, the county official Calvin Pruitt had identified, was indicted on corruption charges. The Meridian Mining Company paid a settlement that was described in newspaper accounts as substantial, which Eleanor Voss, who was by then 21 and had read enough legal documents to have opinions about legal language, believed significantly understated the actual harm. Harold Voss's remains were located in the waked-out section of Shaft 9 in November of 1965 as part of the investigation. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with a blunt force injury to the back of the skull. The cause of death was ruled a homicide. Douglas Pruitt was charged separately with Harold's murder. Robert Callum was charged as an accessory. The trial, which took place in federal court in Lexington in the spring of 1967, lasted 6 weeks. Eleanor attended every day. She sat in the second row of the gallery, behind the prosecution's table, with a notebook in her lap, and she wrote down everything. She was 20 years old when the trial began and 21 when it ended, which seems both very young and entirely appropriate for what she had become. Pruitt was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 23 years. Callum received 15 years for the accessory charge and an additional concurrent sentence on the federal safety violations. Warren Haas received 8 years. Several other Meridian officials received lesser sentences or entered plea agreements. Sheriff Curtis Beale, who had taken Eleanor's notebooks from her and told her she was overwrought when she was 16 years old, was not charged with any crime. There was insufficient evidence to connect him directly to Harold's murder, though the investigation made clear that his failure to pursue the case had been neither incompetence nor indifference. Eleanor wrote that in her notebook with a precision that suggested she had been composing the sentence for a long time. Thomas Wicker, who had eventually gotten a job at a Lexington newspaper when it became clear that covering the Meridian story was going to require someone willing to go places the story's editor wasn't, won a state press award for his reporting on the case. Calvin Pruitt testified at the trial and then moved to Ohio and started over. In the way that people who have done a hard right thing sometimes need to start over somewhere, the weight of it isn't quite so present every day. He and Eleanor corresponded for a few years and then lost touch, the way people do. Eleanor Voss did not move away from Harlan County. People assumed she would, assumed that the place was too freighted with grief and history for her to stay in it. She stayed. She took her father's composition books out of the attic crawlspace where she had hidden them when she was 16, and she kept them. She got a degree in accounting from a school in Hazard and came back and got a job at the county clerk's office, where she worked for 31 years. People in Claiborne said she knew where every document in the county was filed and what it meant, and that you didn't try to bury anything in Harlan County anymore because Eleanor Voss had eyes everywhere and a memory like a steel trap, and an apparently inexhaustible patience for waiting until the right moment arrived. She died in 2019, at 73, which means she outlived Douglas Pruitt, who was released after serving 14 years and died in 1988 of a cardiac event, by 31 years. She outlived Robert Callum and Warren Haas and Curtis Beale. She outlived, in some important sense, the version of Harlan County that had made her father's death possible. Or perhaps not outlived, perhaps simply watched it change into something different, something that still had its shadows and its secrets, as all places do, but that had also been made to account for at least one of the worst things it had done. There's a detail that Eleanor mentioned in a recorded interview she gave to a University of Kentucky oral history project in 2004. She said that on the morning of October 15, 1962, the morning after her birthday, the morning after her father didn't come home, she had sat at the kitchen table with his wallet in her hands and counted the $43 inside it. She had done this not because she needed to know the amount, but because touching his things was a way of being close to him, and because she was 16 and she did not yet know what the correct response to this kind of grief was. She counted the money and then she sat for a long time in the quiet of the kitchen, in a town where the sun didn't reach the valley floor until late morning, in a hollow between two ridgelines that had spent decades learning to keep secrets. And then she got up and she started. That is the thing about Eleanor Voss that is hardest to explain and most important to understand. She did not have resources. She did not have allies. Not at first. She did not have legal training or investigative experience or the protection of an institution. She was 16 years old and she had her father's notebooks, and she had what he had also had, the particular and dangerous quality of noticing things, of writing them down, of refusing to accept that the people who told her she was wrong were right simply because they had more power than she did. Harold Voss had spent 19 months trying to do something about what he knew before they stopped him. His daughter spent 11 years finishing what he started. She never described it as courage. She described it, in that same oral history interview, as not being able to think of anything better to do. There are $43 in a wallet on a kitchen counter in Harlan County, Kentucky, in October of 1962. There is a girl sitting with the wallet in her hands in the morning dark before the sun finds the hollow. There is a notebook in the attic with a dead man's careful writing in it. And there is a question that the powerful men of Claiborne forgot to ask themselves when they decided that Harold Voss was a problem they could solve. What happens to his daughter? What does she do with what she knows, and what she finds, and what she refuses to let the mountains swallow? They forgot to ask that question. It was the last mistake they made. The stories that matter most are rarely the ones that make the news at the moment they happen. They are the ones that take years to surface, that require someone stubborn enough and careful enough and patient enough to keep pulling on a thread long after everyone else has walked away from the room. Harold Voss disappeared on the night his daughter turned 16. What they found, eventually, was not just his body. It was everything he had tried to expose, brought finally into the light by the one person in Claiborne nobody had thought to be afraid of.